particularly interesting, but coming on the heels of Tim's earlier work in diagnostic psychology, the very sophisticated system of personality assessment that he had developed, which was very
What
complex.
what was it when you came into the graduate program? What were you interested in? What brought you into that world of psychology then?
Yeah, I
You
had,
said
you know, I grew up in a family of philosophical and psychological. My father was a psychologist. He was a PhD in psychology in Germany, and he lost his teaching position. In his early 30s, he was given a prestigious teaching position at the University of Berlin, which he was taken away from him then, and he got his degree at the University of Marburg. My father was born in Alsace-Lorraine in 1916 and was a French citizen because of a small village in the Alsace region. And that Alsace region had been given to Germany as part of the Treaty of Versailles. So he had technically he had German papers, and that's how he was able to get out of Buchenwald, because in Kristallnacht he was taken along with a lot of other Jewish luminary intellectuals and academics. So he got out, and we escaped and came to the U.S. in '39 on one of the last boats from Germany. But his work had been recognized in Germany by Gordon Allport, famous psychology at Harvard, who read German. And so my father's early work in synesthesia, actually, was his PhD thesis was on synesthesia with artists, and so on, doing empirical research on that topic, which is interesting from a kind of karmic perspective in terms of where I landed, in terms of my interest in psychedelics. So I had that cultural influence of music and fine art. My father was a pianist and a violinist, and he had a PhD in chemistry. And I think he had the equivalent of MAs in chemistry and mathematics and physics as well. So he could teach a lot of different things. And he ended up being invited by Martin Buber, the great German philosopher, to teach at a school for Jewish youth in Frankfurt, which was the way that he was able to support himself through the Jewish community that at that point was paying these prestigious professors to teach their children, because that was the way they could educate their kids at that time, and given the Nazi, what was happening, and also make a little bit of a living. So I had those were influences on me culturally, and growing up with music and getting interested in jazz and bebop in the early days. And this was the 50s, where I kind of gravitated towards the beatniks and the early stuff going on in San Francisco, and
like the Kerouac and the Ginsberg world.
Yeah, and being and spending time out there, and then in Milwaukee hanging out with jazz musicians. I was a young guy, but I was attracted to hanging out in that area of Milwaukee with a couple of jazz clubs, and being introduced to cannabis by these very loving and protective Black jazz musicians, kind of taking care of this little white boy, in their midst, because they recognized my deep love for the genre, if you will. So I had a bit of experience with the alteration of consciousness, more than a little bit. And I think I shared that story of meeting Tim. I don't know if you've seen that episode where I talk about meeting Tim at Harvard and him offering me that, my saying yes, out of the curiosity that came from my interest in I double majored at Kenyon College in philosophy and psychology. So
Western philosophy?
Western philosophy. I didn't have any exposure to Eastern philosophy then. That came later, through the psychedelics. And I took a very deep dive then, and continued to. But so those were the influences that at least oriented me towards that. You asked me what what were some of the determinants there, some of the variables that impacted me. And so I'm sharing with you the family, the culture, the musical uh, contributions to that as well.
So going back to the change in the awareness or the culture and the way the doorway into speaking about these things from through the Western model, so breaking through the roles. Now we're also seeing that this is one big hallucination, a projection of one's mind.
Mm-hmm.
Part of that understanding, right?
Yeah, you allowed a kind of big preview of that's just part of that constellation, of that phenomenology of recognizing that we're living in a movie, basically. And, we're all characters in our own movies. So everything that happens, including our conversation today, is part of the movie. So even the ingestion of psychedelics is part of the movie that allows you in the movie to have the experience of being apparently out of the movie.
Right.
So it can, and I've talked about this at length in other contexts, but it can be a very useful tool for giving you a simulation, I call it, of the real thing. And I'm not knocking it by using the word simulation. And I think it's an important entry point for you and for me, for millions of other people. The ramifications and the resonance of that continues to use a Gurdjieffian image of an octave, a musical octave, if you will, that, the resonance continues actually to this day. Really interesting for me, given, I'm 86, having gone through all of that, to see what's going on now, in this contemporary so-called Renaissance.
So the people like the meeting, I'm going to go to these periods of time. You had the meeting at
it's a Center for Research and Personality there are probably about 100 people there.
Yeah. So Kelman, and could you speak a little about his relationship to what you were doing?
Well, he was one of the the most vocal among the most vocal opposition of the work. So he and Brendan Marr Brendan Marr was a psychologist too, an English psychologist, behaviorist, and Herb Kelman was a social psychologist, and for whatever the reason, they had different reasons, but they strongly opposed what was going on.
And that was primarily because they were so statistically based or what you might call scientifically based, right?
Yeah, well, they had adopted, as psychology has often done over centuries, or more recent period, a so-called scientific method and the reductionistic method, and all those elements of reductionistic science, Newtonian science, kind of emulating that and hoping to get a kind of a better foot in the door, with the sister sciences, so adopting that kind of reductionistic experimental model, which even a social psychological sphere, it tended to minimize or even ridicule anything that had to do with phenomenology or the subjective exploration of consciousness. So if you look at the Eastern traditions, of meditation and the Vedic sciences and Buddhist sciences, and certainly the history of Asian medicine and acupuncture and so on, there's a great deal of phenomenology going on there as people were studying their nervous systems, with or without psychedelics. So there was a whole kind of competition of a scientific worldview at play there.
And so, but you actually tried to adapt. I mean, I was reading some of these early studies, not just the Concord study, but some of the earlier other studies that you were actually measuring some kinds of behaviors,
Sure.
subjective behaviors, but you were really trying to adapt and actually retort or come back to some of these criticisms.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, Tim was steeped in the scientific method, and so was Richard Alpert or Ramdas, and Ralph Metzner, certainly, coming from Oxford, and myself to some extent too, being exposed to scientific method and philosophy of science and so on. Yeah. So Tim, for example, developed what he called the experiential typewriter, which was a kind of way of trying to map phenomenology, in terms of kind of the stream of consciousness writing, if you will, trying to capture that. Yeah, so, we certainly paid our dues towards that. But at the end of the day, I think, especially when LSD came in to the picture and added a whole other level of kind of cosmic consciousness to the picture, certainly if you look at how LSD or DMT or some of these other substances function, partially dose related, but it's also the nature of the plant medicine, if you will. Psilocybin, more like mescaline, involved a much kind of more aesthetic, aspect to that, of the enhancement of phenomena, basically, and seeing, how the divine shines through phenomena. When LSD came into the picture, it basically the structure dissolved, if you will, and you were in much more kind of more what you would call like kind of emptiness, if you will, okay, or non-dual consciousness.
I think about, because I studied so much of the East, I always say the psilocybin and mescaline, you stayed within the astral dimension where the LSD would bring you into a causal formless dimension where it was just too much to even comprehend. But I want to go back to the use, and what I notice is that so many of the people who were asking for your scientific model from the standard professors there at Harvard, the problem was that they weren't themselves using the substance. They were still trying to stay in that objective point of view outside of the experience itself.
Yeah, with a few notable exceptions, including Harry Murray.
Okay. Right. At what point did he come into the program? Or
I'll speak for the summer before the fall of 1960, when I had come back from living in Europe. I had a Fulbright fellowship in Norway, and I was spending a lot of time there, and also a lot of time in Paris, by the way, hanging out with jazz musicians and expatriate, artists of all types. And so I actually spent the summer as an intern working with Harry Murray, which was the summer before the fall term began, before I met Tim. Oh, wow. So I actually met Murray and spent time with him and had some wonderful tutorials with him and private time with him. And it was a very loving man, very, very intelligent, very refined. Alan came as a visitor, spent a semester living at Tim's house. So, I actually had a couple of psilocybin sessions with him as well. He was a character and a half. Most people don't know this. He was a pretty advanced alcoholic. And so, and actually Tim used to joke. He said, Alan is the sports writer of the cosmic scene. So basically, so Tim had him pegged to a certain extent. Again, he was a brilliant man, very interesting, very funny, but he had his own demons too that came out in his alcoholism and his rages. He had a very troubled marriage or marriages.
I think
So
5.
yeah, so I knew him, and I knew his business manager, Paul. His name was Shapiro, who became a friend of mine. He was a businessman in and lived in Marin, on Mount Tam, a small estate there. And he was actually a client of mine early on, a consulting client, and then we discovered our interest in spiritual work. So he was the business manager of Alan Watts and Virginia Satir and Lama Govinda, who I also spent some time with, and Michael Murphy and other people. So
Oh,
uh,
I don't want to lose Murray in this, but Lama Govinda, here's the story that Metzner and Leary went to India, and that's where he met Lama Govinda.
I don't know. That probably, but
Because
I met Govinda in California actually. I had dinner with him. Uh, Bob Shapiro belonged to a Jewish country club, and he was giving a talk at the country club on some fundraising or something. So he brought Lama Govinda along for a dinner at a Jewish country club, and I hung along. I spent the time in the car with him. The one thing I really remember was how much he was complaining about his publisher. So that was my one of my takeaways. It wasn't until years later that I actually read some of his work. So.
well, one of the stories I heard through many years back is that when Metzner and Leary were in India, they met Lama Govinda, and they introduced him to. I think this is, I don't know what year it is, but they introduced Lama Govinda to either psilocybin or LSD, and Lama Govinda said, "Oh, finally, I'm getting a sense of what it is that these Buddhists are talking about." And then he because he went to Germany, I mean, he went to Tibet in 1938 or 39 or something like that. Well, he then took him, Leary and Metzner, to meet his Lama. And the Lama said to Leary, and this is what I've been told, we've been waiting for you. And Leary says, well, what do you mean we've been waiting? You've been waiting for us. He says, in our tradition, which is, has a prophecy, and even going back to the 13th Dalai Lama, this is the core of the Dharma was corrupted, known that Buddhism was going to fail as a religion in Tibet. But what he told Leary, he said, back in 1924, 25, we gave the Tibetan Book of the Dead to Evan Wentz because we knew, we only gave him a portion of it because we knew you would be back for more. And now you're coming back asking for more. And I don't know where the Tibetan Book of the Dead came into that psychedelic training part of your program. And that was
It came
probably at
in
Millbrook?
at Millbrook, yeah, and it was through LSD rather than through psilocybin, and the nature of, as you're describing, the causal level of that experience. And I remember, I have so many stories. We could go on for days, but the Bob Thurman, who was a undergraduate at Harvard then, was hanging out in our scene, and it was through Bob Thurman, and this was when I was living for a summer. I moved actually to Millbrook. I had a teaching job at Brandeis University that Abraham Maslow gave me, my first teaching position, because he was interested in our work. He was writing about peak experiences, and we were in the business of manufacturing them. So
Maslow.
Yeah, so he was very interested in that. So he expended some political capital to get me a significant amount, actually, to get me a teaching position at Brandeis, and we were going to work together on this topic. He had never, to the best of my knowledge, he never took psychedelics. He was actually had some trepidation about that, and he also had his own demons and his own insecurities, being in a department that was dominated on the left spectrum by psychoanalysis and on the right spectrum by cognitive behaviorism. And here he was in the middle doing, self-actualization work and then some deeper work. So he had a lot of insecurity because he was kind of odd man out in his own department of psychology. But he happened to be the chairman of that year, and so he threw a little weight around, got me a position, much to my parents' delight and my own delight. Coming out, getting out
Well,
of
I think
Harvard
it's
Poll.
I think it's interesting that I mean to ask you a little bit about this. Did you actually finish and get a degree, a graduate degree? That was amazing
Yeah.
that you could have. I don't know how
Well, I
you
was
managed that.
protected. I was protected by Gordon Allport, who let it be known to keep their people's hands off me, to let me finish my PhD. So I just developed a quick and dirty PhD on a topic I didn't have a lot of interest in. Although, as I look back on it now, it was actually it was a topic on when people become aware that they're being verbally conditioned.
What when people come aware what?
When they're being verbally conditioned.
Ah,
So, at what point in the interaction with someone do they become aware that they're being verbally conditioned? What are the cues? So I wrote my thesis on awareness, actually. It happened to be awareness in the context of this particular, kind of operant model, but probably no accident, because I originally wanted to do my thesis on kind of building on the model of David McClelland's achievement and affiliation and power motivation model, which was very dominant then. So I came up with an idea to do a thesis on the need for transcendence, basically, as one of and I actually had negotiated a little bit that with McClelland. He was interested.
was he your advisor?
No, but he brought Tim to Harvard. That's a whole other backstory.
Ah,
So, and
who was he? Who was your advisor at the time?
Tim. Uh,
Ah,
yeah,
okay.
when the story I tell, on a couple of the interviews is being coming to the Center for Research and Personality, meeting my faculty advisor. I didn't know who he was, and then Tim telling me about the summer he had spent in Cuernavaca and his experiences and what he was committed to, and was I interested in studying? I said, yes, sign me up. So
Right.
he was my advisor. Now, coming back to the earlier topic of Kelman and Brendan Maher and the others, the other piece that's operating there around around the controversy was there was a lot of envy because a lot of the graduate students were interested in the psychedelics. Here these Tim is this kind of charismatic, Brendan Bahan Irish poet, kind of functioning like a little bit like a kind of like Kali's dance, if you will, in the middle of of the in the middle of the rational universe of the center of rationalism in Western society of Harvard, and doing non-conceptual explorations. So that was pretty powerful, and so there's a lot of interest in that among graduate students. So I think there was some envy and jealousy around that too that fed that.
I want to go back to your time with Murray. So how did
Mhm.
you get you were there? When did you work with Murray?
It was the summer before the fall term of 1960.
Before the fall term of 1960.
Yeah, I began my Harvard graduate study and the meeting with Tim in the fall, of 1960s when I began officially. But I was there the summer before, getting housing and getting oriented, and working as a intern, or I think it was an intern with Murray. Yeah, so that I did a couple of projects with Murray that summer. So working with the TAT.
So I don't know if you're familiar with there was an article and there's a book by a guy who, it was in the Atlantic Monthly, and it was about Murray's program that he was working in. They took 20 freshmen. This is like in 1959, 1958. I don't know do you know what Murray was working on at the time? What kind of work he was doing?
I don't remember now. I remember doing some work with the TAT, the Thematic Apperception Test.
Yes, right.
The tool he developed. He had been psychoanalyzed, by the way, by Jung.
Right.
So
right.
he had this enormous kind of, background and written a book, a very definitive book on the psychoanalytic interpretation of Moby Dick. And so he had all of that, that was an extraordinary kind of preparation for psychedelic, so for his own psychedelic. So I remember working with the TAT that summer, doing some coding. It was fairly menial, my work, because I was a kind of a graduate student or about to be a graduate student. But I remember many, many evenings and afternoons with him. He was so kind and fun to hang out with,
And so he eventually became familiar or knew that the Psilocybin project was happening, and he at one point participated in a
with Tim. I think he had one or two, at least a couple of sessions with Tim. Tim was his guide, basically. So he was always very friendly. So and so coming back from a moment to another, you mentioned the Lama Govinda and meeting his teacher and the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So I have an analogous story of Bob Thurman, I started to mention, whose teacher was Geshe Wango in New Jersey. And Geshe Wango was I believe, a Mongolian Buddhist who had a lot of also Bon influence. And he was one of the first Tibetan lamas to be in the U.S. So Bob ended up becoming part of his monastic community in New Jersey. So at one point, I remember the summer I was at Millbrook. I only lasted the summer before I decided I made a mistake. I'd moved there. I'd given up my teaching job at Brandeis, and Abe Mazza was very unhappy because, again, he had his hopes that we could work together. So I decided just to drop out at that point. I had two young children. My son and daughter were like 5 and 3, and my wife at the time, Karen. And we moved to Millbrook, lock, stock, and barrel. And then I had a dream one night, a lucid dream of which I won't go to the details now, but basically it was like a kind of the symbolism was being understood and interpreted as I was dreaming. It was lucid, as opposed to kind of a typical Jungian post-analytic interpretation. This was like in my face, so to speak. And it basically showed me that I had to leave, that I was putting my life and my family's life at risk, certainly my professional life, my health, and so on. So that was when I left Millbrook and moved back to Cambridge, and then picked up some jobs and ended up going back into academia for some years. It was basically the end of my work with psychedelics, until the Renaissance, when I've been experimenting again a little bit in preparation for my own mortality. So, but the story I want to tell you here is Geshe Wango. It was I remember that afternoon in Millbrook where Tim received a large mandala from Geshe Wango, which was the image of a Tibetan deity being kind of impaled on a cliff. for having violated some cosmic agreements. And and he was sending a message to Tim about basically, what Tim was putting himself in through, basically, in terms of the kind of the messianic martyrdom, if you will. And I remember last year doing a podcast, a private podcast with Bob Thurman in a ketamine training session that was being held up at Bob and Nina's place in New York, where he and I had spoken, and we hadn't spoken in many years. And I recounted that incident to him, and he remembered it, and he kind of shed more light on it as his wont and his own brilliance. So also my own teacher in the Gurdjieff work, Willem Nyland, who had worked with Gurdjieff in Europe. Nyland was a Dutchman who was a PhD in chemistry, concert pianist, and a senior teacher in the Gurdjieff work, who left the Gurdjieff Foundation because he felt it was kind of becoming too dependent, if you will, or too intellectualized, too dependent on Uspensky. Anyway, he was my teacher in the Gurdjieff work. So at one point, he knew my background at Harvard, and actually that was create a little bit of a controversy among my peers in the Gurdjieff work who were very critical of me. But he wanted me there, if nothing else, to be maybe an irritant to to the other students. So it was very Gurdjieffian kind of, his then, if you will. So he agreed. So I set up a meeting actually with Nyland and Tim, a group of us at Millbrook, and a group of his New York students who came up to Millbrook. And we had this very interesting meeting where he spoke at length about his views about psychedelics and their risks and dangers and their potential. And I remember a private conversation with Nyland and Tim and myself, where I was just sort of the fly on the wall, but where he said to Tim, "What you're doing is really important. And, these substances have a tremendous role to play in society and in science and understanding mental health and so on. So, but you're going about it the completely wrong way. You're just drawing on yourself the ire and the antagonism of society. And you need to stop, and you need to figure out a new way of doing this." So he was encouraging of the work, but very critical of the way Tim was going about it. And at that point,
similar to Huxley and other folks who were more of the kind of let's step it back a little bit, not a Ken Kesey kind of thing, because he comes in and blows the whole thing out of the water. But I wanted to ask you about your involvement with Uspensky and Gurdjieff. When did you get into the work? When did you get into that?
1964, 65. I had finished my PhD. I was teaching at Brandeis. I was that year before I moved there, I was visiting Millbrook a lot on weekends, driving from Cambridge. And one of the things we were so prompted to start studying things like the Buddhist texts and the Vedic texts and other spiritual teachings, both Western and Eastern, but mostly Eastern, including then the writing of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, Tim's and Ralph and Richard's version of that. So I was deeply involved in those conversations, and we were referring books and ideas to each other. And I remember being turned on to Uspensky by Ralph. Ralph had actually had commuted off into the city from Warwick, New York, and attended some of Nyland's meetings in New York. He told me about him, and I discovered that Nyland was one of the teachers of the Gurdjieff work who had worked with Gurdjieff himself. He was in his 70s, and that he had a group in Boston as well. So I became part of the Boston group, and I would go to New York and to New York City, and then to Warwick, first to Warwick and then to Brewster, New York, where we established a center in Brewster, first in Brewster and then in Warwick. So I got an early involvement with that work through Mr. Nyland.
And what about the work itself that was attractive to you? What brought you in through that kind of psilocybin work that you were doing previous? Was there
Yeah, well,
a continuum?
there was a continuum, because what got our attention was a interaction between Gurdjieff and Uspensky that Uspensky describes in The Search of the Miraculous, where they're talking apparently about psychedelics, because he quotes Gurdjieff as saying, there are these substances, they can be used to help people. This is a crude, my true translation, basically, or interpretation, but there's a place and a role for these historically, for these kind of experiences and substances that produce these experiences, and they can be used in an experimental way. And one of their ways they can be used is to help people have an experience of the direction they want to go. It can open a window to them.
Did you ever come up? Because I'm thinking of the Siberian mushrooms, which have a whole world of was Gurdjieff aware of what was in the Siberian?
I don't know. Gurdjieff was such an extraordinary human being and teacher, and his experiences in Africa, in China, in Japan, in Tibet, in the 22 years he traveled with a group of people, of searchers of the truth. They came across a lot of different things. And, fast forward now, many, many years, when I became a student and a practitioner of Tai Chi and Qigong and Neigong, which I still do, I am coming across the Taoist inner alchemy practices of the transformation of substances. There's a direct correlation, actually, between Gurdjieff's table of hydrogen and the transformation of substances from, or what Gurdjieff called the Hamblem Zwan, which was his name for prana or chi, basically.
Did you ever run across John Blofeld?
Well, yes, I read John Blofeld early. It's interesting because this last year I've come across a teacher in the Gurdjieff work who, like myself, has studied for over 20, 25 years Taoist inner alchemy practices as well as the Gurdjieff. And he's developed a whole teaching model where those are integrated. And
it seems like Blofeld was the last one aware of that energy associated with, I mean, in the real esoteric aspect of Taoism. But as you say, I could go for hours on this, and maybe we'll have another time. But I want to go back to Harvard. Pusey, did he ever have his nose in any of this in a real way?
No. But, the backstory there is that a member of the Harvard Board of Governors, which is essentially their board of directors, was the diamond merchant in New York City. The family now escapes the name. They're well known. Maybe it'll come to me. But his son was at Harvard.
Well, this is where Andrew Weil comes in.
Yeah.
And Ram Dass.
Right.
I know this. I know the story through Ram Dass.
Okay. So then the story, and the other part of that story is, or at least with Andrew Weil's involvement. I remember sitting in Harvard Square at a little coffee place, which was right in the heart of the square, and having an afternoon tea or coffee, and then overhearing a conversation at the table next to me, where a group of Harvard undergraduates were talking about their mescaline experiences and how they were going about getting their mescaline. And Andrew Weil was part of that, driving that conversation. So I didn't know who he was. I just found it interesting that I was kind of just tuning in, listening, eavesdropping on this conversation. And then, a few months later, here is Andrew kind of leading the charge in the Harvard Crimson. And there's a whole, and you probably talked to Ramdas, so the backstory on that of him wanting to take psilocybin and not, and Richard refusing. And so that part of maybe what fueled part of, Andrew's mission there was anger at being rejected. I don't know. I mean, there's so many elements. Well, the good thing is they reconciled. I remember Richard telling me.
Well, I think you hit it right on the head. I think it was you. You said that Leary was much more able to reconcile. Ramdas was not, and I know him personally. He was not ready. He was not going to give that one up.
He did later on. I mean, he and I were friends for many, many years, and Ellen, my wife, and I, up until the COVID came on the scene, every winter we would spend a month or so in Maui. We would spend time with Richard. I have a lot of photographs up to the time of hanging out with him just a few months before he passed away. And we shared many stories over the years over dinner around the Harvard and the people and, for example, the Peggy Hitchcock family and the Tommy and Billy. And sooner or later, everybody came and paid their respects to Ramdas, in Maui. And there was a lot of healing. And I don't know if Andrew Weil ever went there, but I remember talking.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. Yes, he did.
So it was,
I remember bringing Ramdas home. We were close, and we were going. He was living in Sausalito at the time, and we were going past Blackie's pasture, and he turned to me. He says, "I don't know if I'm a icon or a relic." Well, he turned out to be an icon because, as you say, towards the end of his life, everybody from any aspect of any 1960s, 70s period, he was a central focus of that time. And so everybody at some point in time had some acknowledgement or they owed him some recognition or honorary.
I agree. He became what he always wanted to be. I remember driving through Harvard Square one afternoon. I hadn't seen him for a bunch of years, and I stopped at a stoplight there, and I had a little Austin Cooper, the little early version of that, and I was attracted. I looked out my passenger window, and I saw all I could see was a cutout of a long white robe and a long brown mala necklace, which you didn't see that much of, So I kind of curious. I looked through I turned right, looked through my window, and looked up, and here's Ramdas standing there with his beard and the mala and the whole dhoti and so on. So he looks at me, I look at him, he gets in the car, and we drive to my home there on forgot the street. And for the next few hours, he downloads his whole experience in India with Kareem Crowley and the LSD and so on. So I had a first person anecdote story from him about that. And then I was in touch with him off and on over the years as he was teaching and developing his reputation. And, I was mildly critical at times because I saw him really wanting to be a guru and stepping into that role and doing that almost exactly the way he stepped into his role of being a teacher at Harvard. He was brilliant. He was funny. He was seductive. He had a gift of gab. He used the art of self-criticism. He had tuned that up to a fine art.
That was it. That was it. That's what brought everybody. You're just like us, Yeah,
it's like a Jewish thing also. The deprecation and the humor and the insights. It's kind of the package. So I
Well,
saw him applying those wares in the guru context, and
well,
knowing, knowing, given our history, loving him deeply. But
well,
so
that,
anyway,
that, that
but in fairness, I would say at the end of his life, when I saw him a number of years, he became the heart of love. He became he became the bhakti,
yeah,
total,
yeah.
bhakti path, and it's absolutely real and absolutely genuine and full of love. So
Well, that showman was always, as a youngster, he was, as a kid, he was the showman. When
yeah.
Timothy came back from India and Ramdas was down at the Lower East Side doing his shtick in
Mhm.
the comedy clubs, he was always a showman
Yeah,
of
absolutely. Again, the game changed when LSD came in. So coming back
right,
to an earlier point we were discussing, if there was much interest in scientific work, that LSD kind of blew that out, if you will.
right,
Yeah.
right. So did you, towards the end, when things were beginning to, from the officials' point of view, start to get out of hand, when McClellan couldn't contain it anymore or whatever.
Mhm.
Did you see that coming? Did you get a sense of
Oh,
the?
sure, sure. We knew the handwriting was on the wall. And, so part of the preparation was to create IFIF, uh, and which we did. And we rented a colonial building, or house, office in Harvard Square. We had a little bit of a staff there. Uh, we were starting to do more writing. And then, of course, through Tim's and Richard's connections with the Hitchcock family in New York, to Peggy Hitchcock, uh, they were given the use of the estate up, the Hitchcock, the Dietrich estate up in Warwick, a 3,000-acre estate, and a whole enormous mansion with 22 rooms or more. Uh, so then everything moved there. So I had to stay around Cambridge to finish my PhD, and which I did, that for that period, and then being given the teaching job by Maslow, and then deciding to quit my job after the first year. I had a 3-year appointment,
Now
tenure
you were
track.
married with children. You're married with children then.
Yeah, my daughter Rachel was 5 years old, and my son Michael was 3 years old, and they still live in Cambridge and Boston area actually. So they're in their 60s now, late 60s. So uh, yeah, and again, as I mentioned, I had this dream, and then that prompted me to move back to Cambridge and start my life again in a very ordinary way. And of course, the Gurdjieff work then was a major support for me, an ally, as I was going back through that transition and just becoming an ordinary bloke again, without all the psychedelic, reputation and paraphernalia and all of that. And I took this, I took the Gurdjieff work very seriously and did the Gurdjieff movements, was deeply involved in that for many years. And then when Mr. Nyland passed away and the group became a little fossilized, as spiritual groups will tend to do, I started studying on my own. Gurdjieff, used Uspensky in that way to enroll and to publicize and to create interest among the Russian and then later other intelligentsia.
Right, right. Yeah.
And so I believe the Gurdjieff work has been very, very important as a kind of in the form of its emanations and its role in new so-called New Age thinking and in current environmental thinking, and in the work of Chardin. You look at a very powerful influence of that
Well,
teaching.
I would love to integrate Ouspensky and Gurdjieff with even Jung and Steiner and that whole period of time. It's a whole kind
Yeah, I think one of the issues, for
rich.
example, which you mentioned, Evans Wentz, that Wentz was so influenced by Jungian ideas that I think he missed a lot of stuff. Because he was looking at it through a Jungian lens, if you will, which is fine. but it doesn't really take into consideration the deepest teachings of emptiness. Basically, I don't think he ever understood that. Got that piece of it, which is, in a way, that's the core of, in my understanding, in my practice of Buddhist practices and understanding, the view is the most important piece. That's that's the first
Absolutely.
step, the view, basically. And so if you're introduced to the view in a transmission, in the a la kind of Garab Dorji, story of verbal, symbolic, or telepathic transmission, and it can be through psychedelics, that can establish the view as well. So, yeah, happy to talk further. So, God bless.
Well, thank you very much. All right.
Take care.
Have a good one.
Bye-bye.